Before anyone realized what was happening, the quiet hum of spinning wheels inside the store began to feel less like a test ride and more like a confession waiting to be overheard, as though the walls themselves were about to reveal secrets they had guarded for years, secrets that would change how everyone saw this place forever. If you're drawn to stories about hidden truths, quiet heroes, and the moment justice finally finds its voice, stay with this story, and if its tone resonates with you, don't forget to like and subscribe as the journey begins. Because on that ordinary afternoon, when the sunlight slipped through the glass windows of Velocity Sports and painted long stripes across rows of polished bicycles, I watched a man who looked like just another customer roll a matte black mountain bike across the showroom floor. His posture relaxed, his clothes unremarkable, his presence almost invisible, yet there was something in the way his eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, that made it feel as if he wasn't browsing but measuring the air itself, weighing every sound, every glance, every subtle shift in the room. And as he adjusted the handlebars with practiced precision, he paused long enough for the faint clink of tools from the workshop to drift toward him like a coded message. While near the front counter, two young customers leaned casually against a display of helmets, their voices low but careless, unaware that someone only a few meters away was listening, not with curiosity but with the kind of attention reserved for moments that might never come again. And when one of them let out a dry laugh and said that this shop wasn't what it used to be, that something felt off behind the polished surfaces and cheerful sales pitches, the man on the bike didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even shift his weight, as if the words had struck something deeper than mere interest. And when the other customer replied that he'd heard rumors about staff who didn't care anymore, about mistakes quietly blamed on someone who never defended himself, about an old mechanic in the back who carried the weight of the store while others enjoyed the credit, the man's fingers tightened around the rubber grips just enough to reveal tension beneath his calm exterior. And I could almost feel the moment stretching, pulling, thickening like fog, because the mechanic they spoke of was visible through the glass partition of the workshop, bent slightly over a child's bicycle with the kind of patience usually reserved for priceless artifacts, his hands moving slowly yet confidently, adjusting tiny screws, wiping grease with a cloth worn thin by years of use, while younger employees walked past him without a glance, laughing over their phones, and the contrast was so stark it felt painful, as if two different worlds existed within the same store, one glittering with modern ambition and sales targets, the other quietly anchored by a man whose name no one bothered to remember. And as the disguised rider rolled forward to test the bike's gears, he asked a salesperson a simple question about warranty policies, only to receive a rushed, half-hearted answer that barely concealed indifference. And it was in that moment that I sensed the truth he was uncovering wasn't about bikes or business at all, but about something far more fragile. The soul of a place that had once been built on passion and fairness, but had slowly drifted toward convenience and neglect. And when a sudden laugh erupted from near the storage room, followed by a whispered remark that should never have been spoken aloud, that it would be easy to pin the next inventory mistake on the old guy, because management barely noticed him anyway. The man on the bike finally looked up, his gaze sharp now, no longer pretending to be just another customer. And although no one recognized him, the air around him seemed to shift, as if the store itself sensed a reckoning approaching, while he slowly pedaled toward the workshop, stopping just short of the glass wall, pretending to examine a gear shifter while secretly observing the mechanic's tired eyes, the faint tremor in his hands, the quiet dignity in his posture. And when the mechanic looked up briefly and offered a polite smile, one that carried gratitude for being seen, even if only for a second, the disguised man nodded back with an expression that hinted at something far more complicated than casual politeness. And as the customers at the front counter continued their conversation, speculating about how long the shop could keep pretending everything was fine, the man on the bike turned slightly so he could hear every word, every careless assumption, every rumor that had grown unnoticed in the shadows of polished floors and promotional banners. And it was then that I realized this was not just a Slucci encounter or an undercover visit born of curiosity, but the beginning of a quiet investigation driven by a sense of responsibility that had been buried under years of expansion and success. Because the man riding that bike was not simply testing a product, he was testing his own creation, searching for the truth behind the brand he had once built with hope and ideals. And as he rolled past a row of high-end racing models toward the exit, pausing just long enough to glance back at the mechanic still working alone, I felt the weight of what was coming. The kind of change that never arrives gently, but instead crashes through complacency like a storm. And in that single lingering look, half regret, half resolve, was the unspoken promise that whatever he had just heard would not be ignored, not this time. Because somewhere between the whispered rumors at the counter and the quiet loyalty of the man in the workshop, something had broken open, and from that moment on, nothing inside Velocity Sports would ever be the same again. By the time the afternoon crowd began to thin and the golden light outside the windows shifted into a softer, more uncertain glow, the disguised rider had stopped pretending that he was just another customer, because every sound in the store now carried meaning. Every laugh felt heavier. Every casual remark seemed to hide something that didn't want to be exposed. And as he leaned the bike against a rack and pretended to scroll through his phone, he watched the workshop with a focus that bordered on obsession, noticing how Ervind moved with quiet precision, how he never raised his voice even when younger employees brushed past him, how he apologized for delays that were never his fault, and how customers instinctively trusted him more than anyone else, even though he stood far from the spotlight of sales counters and glossy displays. Meanwhile, near the storage room, the same two employees who had earlier joked about blaming the old mechanic were now speaking again, their voices low but careless, convinced that the store's noise would swallow their words. And when one of them said that management only cared about numbers, not people, and that it wouldn't take much effort to make Ervind look incompetent, the disguised man felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with anger alone, but with the realization that his absence from the daily life of his own business had allowed a culture of quiet cruelty to grow unnoticed, like mold behind a beautiful wall. And as he slowly walked toward the water dispenser, he overheard a customer complaining about a delayed repair, only for Ervind to step forward and calmly take responsibility, even though the mistake had clearly come from someone else, promising to fix it without hesitation. And the gratitude in the customer's eyes contrasted painfully with the indifference of the staff, who should have shared the burden, making it clear that the old mechanic had become the invisible backbone of the shop, the one person holding together a system that others were slowly letting decay. Later, when the store briefly quieted, the disguised rider wandered into the accessories aisle and struck up a casual conversation with a junior employee, asking how long people usually stayed at Velocity Sports. And the employee shrugged with a careless smile, saying that most people didn't last long because the pressure was high and the rewards were uneven, then added with a laugh that Ervind had probably stayed only because he had nowhere else to go, a remark that landed with a cruelty so casual it felt almost worse than open hostility. And in that moment the rider realized that what he was witnessing wasn't just individual behavior, but a deeper shift in values, a slow erosion of respect that had happened while the business grew bigger, faster, more profitable, and less human. As evening approached and the store prepared to close, he watched Ervind carefully lock away tools, double-check unfinished repairs, and quietly wipe down workbenches while others chatted about weekend plans. And when Ervind finally stepped outside, the disguised man followed him at a distance, not out of suspicion, but out of a strange need to understand the life of someone his own company had overlooked, watching him ride an old scooter through narrow streets where neon signs flickered and traffic horns echoed like restless thoughts, until he stopped in front of a modest building that barely looked like a home, climbing a narrow staircase to a small rented room whose dim light revealed shelves of worn books, spare bike parts, and framed photographs of younger days. And as the rider sat in his car across the street, he felt the weight of realization settle over him. Not as guilt alone, but as clarity, because success had blinded him to the quiet sacrifices happening within his own walls. And he understood that if nothing changed, the rumors he had overheard would soon become reality, not just for Ervind, but for the entire spirit of Velocity Sports. The next morning, when he returned to the store without his disguise, he carried with him not anger but a plan, a resolve shaped by everything he had seen and heard. And as he stepped inside with a calm expression that hid the storm beneath, the employees greeted him with forced smiles. unaware that the quiet man who had listened to their words and watched their actions was about to reveal a truth they never imagined he possessed. While somewhere in the workshop, Irvin tightened the final bolt on a bicycle, unaware that the fragile balance he had silently maintained for years was about to shift forever. And as I watched the scene unfold, I knew that the story was no longer about a shop or a bike or a rumor, but about the moment when accountability finally arrives. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has seen enough and decided that silence is no longer an option. The next morning arrived with a strange stillness, the kind that feels less like peace and more like anticipation. And when Rohan Mehta walked into Velocity Sports without a disguise, the staff sensed it instantly, even before they fully recognized him, because his calm expression carried a weight that made casual greetings feel hollow. He moved through the showroom slowly, watching how employees handled customers, how responsibilities shifted away from certain people and toward one familiar figure in the workshop. And when an inventory error surfaced just before noon, the tension he had predicted finally revealed itself, as two employees subtly pointed toward Irvin, suggesting that the old mechanic had been near the stockroom again, their voices carefully shaped to sound reasonable rather than cruel, while Irvin stood stunned, trying to explain himself with quiet sincerity that no one seemed ready to defend, until Rohan stepped forward and asked everyone to stop, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. And with a few taps on his phone, he projected footage onto the store's display screen. Snippets of conversations, moments of manipulation, casual jokes about framing Irvin, proof that could no longer be dismissed. And as the truth unfolded in front of staff and customers alike, the confident expressions of the guilty employees faded into silence, while Rohan spoke not with anger but with clarity, explaining that a business built on talent but lacking integrity was already failing. That numbers meant nothing if people were treated as disposable, and that the true strength of Velocity Sports had never been its branding or sales, but the quiet dedication of those who worked without recognition. Then he turned to Irvin and acknowledged him openly, telling him that his loyalty had been the reason customers trusted the store, that his patience had held together what others had neglected, and that he deserved respect, not suspicion. And in that moment, Irvin's eyes filled with emotion he had never allowed himself to show, because for the first time in years he felt seen rather than overlooked. The consequences came quickly. Those responsible were dismissed, procedures were changed, and Irvin was promoted to head technician with better pay and authority. But the real transformation was not administrative, it was cultural, because suddenly the staff understood that kindness was no longer optional and accountability could no longer be avoided. In weeks later, when the store felt warmer, conversations kinder, and teamwork genuine, Rohan realized that his undercover visit had revealed more than flaws in his company. It had exposed the cost of silence and the power of paying attention. And as I watched Velocity Sports glowing under evening lights, customers laughing, employees working with renewed purpose, and Irvin guiding younger technicians with quiet confidence, it became clear that this was not just the story of an owner who tested his own business, but of a truth that finally surfaced, proving that sometimes the most meaningful change begins when someone who has the power to ignore a problem chooses instead to face it.